Daniel. Watch out for behind you. Typical bad guy on your left with a knife. Get him. Duck. Oh, that was a good one. Oh, wow, fireworks. Behind the dumpster. Bad guy number 2. Oh, I'll take care of this one. Oh, great. Good shot. You're great. This is awesome. You're a natural. That was close. 12 o'clock. Behind the dumpster. Get him. 2 o'clock. Northeast. You see him, right? Oh, good. Never mind. I got him. Oh, wow. He's trying to run. Let's run over. Whew. All in the day's work. This is going to work out. Just fine.
The first time I thought I was going to die, I was 16 years old. I was slumped against the outside wall of what was supposed to be an abandoned warehouse, bleeding from a bullet wound and desperately wishing I hadn't dropped my gun. The only person who was supposed to be in the warehouse was some drug dealer that ripped Jeffrey off a few weeks ago. Jeffrey had approached me and said this was a perfect time to prove my loyalty and commitment. He gave me a vague description of a man, average height and dark hair, and something about always wearing a blue jacket. That simple description was all I had to go on. I had never actually seen him, and yet Jeff handed me a gun and gave me the address, instructions to kill him, and sent me on my merry way. I could still see his beaming face as I hesitantly accepted the firearm. And despite the fact that I grew up in a neighborhood rife with gun violence and my own personal involvement in organized criminal activity, I had never fired a gun. I carried a knife and cut a few people in a fight once, but there was something so much more serious about a gun. Something so final. With a blade, it took some precision and effort to fatally wound. With a gun, all you needed was a squeeze of the trigger. I swallowed my nervousness and accepted the order. Killing a man was simply the price to pay to earn the trust and move up in the world. I showed up at the warehouse and found that the drug dealer had friends. Armed friends. And the next thing I knew, I was leaning against the metal siding of a warehouse, wounded and defenseless. I dropped my gun at some point. I don't even remember what happened. I was dead. I closed my eyes. So, this was it? I should have been more upset than I was. I was going to die. I heard the men yelling not far off in the distance. I never had a chance.
Fuck. Where did the little shit go?
The voice sounded as though it was coming from the other side of the wall.
I don't know. You sure he's with Jeffrey? I ain't never seen him before. Yeah, I'd recognize this skinny shit anywhere.
There was a pause in the conversation, and I found myself holding my breath. Not as though that was actually going to do me any good.
I think he went this way.
I let my breath out. Yep, I was sure that was it. I looked down at the small river of blood flowing down my arm and pooling on the cement. I could get up and run. There was nothing seriously wrong with me, but I was winded and dizzy. Even if I managed to get up and run, there was nowhere to go. I didn't know the area as well as the men did.
I have to wonder, are you really ready to die?
I looked up at the sound of another voice. It was different from the others I had heard. The voice was male, but softer than the others. Yet, there was a deep pitch to it that sent chills down my spine. I craned my neck around, trying to find the source, but I couldn't see anyone.
Do you realize everything that dying entails? There are an awful lot of details that are overlooked.
This time, the voice was followed by the sound of footsteps that came down from the alley.
Every cell in your body starts choking and dying. Neurons become confused, sending erratic last messages. Limbs begin to twitch. And of course there is the matter of bowels emptying. Well, Are you as ready to die as you think you are?
One of the men was probably just messing with me, like a cat playing with its food. Why does it matter to you? I croaked. My voice was growing tired. I looked down the alleyway. The footsteps continued until I could make out a figure in the distance. The owner of the voice was a young man. He couldn't have been much older than me. He was dressed in a neat black suit with a dark red dress shirt. It was too dark in the alley to make out the details of his face, but his skin was so pale and he was almost glowing. He came close to me and I could better make out his face. His features were calm and even, and there was a slight smirk curling on his thin lips. If you're gonna kill me, just do it, I spat. He was messing with me. I knew he was.
Amazingly, I am here to do the exact opposite,
he said. He knelt down next to me and I shivered. It was as though he was radiating cold.
I am here to save you.
Who are you? It was the only thing I could think of to say. The men yelling from the other end of the alley drew my attention away from the strange man. The drug dealer and his armed friends had found me and were moving in for their kill. It didn't matter who killed me at that point. I just knew I was going to die.
But you're not,
the man said quietly. Not what? Did he just read my mind? I stared at him, and he nodded slightly before replying.
Going to die. Now just sit here while I take care of this. Then we can have a proper conversation,
he said, turning towards the armed men. I just stared at him. Maybe I was already dead or dying and this was some sort of hallucination. The armed men moved closer. They didn't seem the least bit concerned with the strange man.
Who are you talking to? Are you praying or something? Can't say that's a bad idea in your position,
a man barked, earning harsh laughter from the others. Did they not see him, the man in the suit? I looked to the stranger, and he only offered me a sardonic grin.
We're gonna send a message to Jeffrey and to the rest of them, thinking that they could just go and send some little twerp to take us.
A different man spoke up. I recognized him as a man I had been sent to kill. I think his name was Jamie's something. Why was I thinking of that now? Why did it matter? The men started towards me, and in a moment of panic, I forced myself to my feet, but the blood loss had left me dizzy, and I ended up tumbling forward, smacking my face into the ground. I closed my eyes and listened to the footsteps. Any moment now, I'd be killed. A pathetic 16-year-old kid who got in over his head, dead from a bullet in the skull.
You're not dying. Stop being dramatic,
I heard the stranger's voice chime before 5 gunshots echoed in the alleyway. I squeezed my eyes shut and braced for the sting of bullets that never came. The only thing that followed was silence. Slowly, I lifted my head up. The stranger was leaning against the wall across from me, arms folded across his chest. He nodded over to where the men had been. They were all dead with 5 efficient bullets, 1 to each of their heads. I looked back to the stranger, who shrugged. I told you this isn't your time to die. Here, he said, and kicked a gun over to me. It's easier to convince someone that you killed people if you are holding the murder weapon. You killed them? I pulled myself back into a sitting position and stared at the gun. Yes, it's what I do. Death is my business. He was smiling. Nothing like the smirk he had been wearing before. He offered a hand to help me to my feet, which I accepted. I recoiled as soon as my hand touched his. He was ice cold. It was chilly out here tonight, sure, but this man's hand felt like nothing short of an ice sculpture. He noticed my reaction and reached out and grabbed my wrist and pulled me the rest of the way to my feet. Who are you? Just an individual in the business of death. You already said that. I mean, who are you? What are you doing here? The man didn't reply. He went down and picked up the gun and held it out to me. You'll need this. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed the weapon from his hands. The thing felt awkward in my left hand, but my right hand was hanging limply at my side, useless aside from sending a steady wave of pain through my body. I awkwardly aimed the weapon at the stranger's head. I was going to get answers from him one way or another. "Who are you? What do you want with me?" I demanded. His only reply was to raise his eyebrows. "Answer me, damn it!"
I am just doing business, and I just wanted to offer you an opportunity to invest in my business.
I bared my teeth. None of these answers were helping ease my suspicions that this man was some sort of enforcer, here just to clean up the whole mess.
I'm not going to kill you,
the man said quietly. "Then tell me who you are. Who are you with?" I weakly waved the gun at him as I spoke. He sighed.
It is unlikely that you will believe me, but I am deaf.
Bullshit, I spat.
No, really, I am,
he said, and reached into his back pocket. As soon as his hand moved, I panicked. The trigger wasn't as heavy as I thought it would be. It moved easily under my finger. The resulting bang was nearly deafening. I watched the bullet fly towards the stranger. My shaky hand wasn't aiming anywhere in particular, but somehow, most likely because we were standing so close to each other, the bullet hit the stranger in the stomach. Or at least I thought it did. I saw the bullet race towards the man. I saw it disappear into his body. The man showed no reaction, not even a wince. There wasn't even a hole in his suit jacket. He barely paused in his motion of digging something out of his back pocket. I dropped the gun. Who? What are you?
I told you. I am deaf. And yes, you did shoot me. But as you can imagine, I am rather immune to that sort of thing.
He had his wallet in his hand and pulled something out of it.
Now, this is for you.
He held out a simple black business card. Again, I was left with nothing to do but stare. My brain didn't know what to do with itself. So much had happened. Almost dying, being saved, a stranger claiming his death, shooting said stranger, and now the man was offering me a business card? If it wasn't for the constant pain in my shoulder, I would say this was a dream.
Take it. It's just a way to contact me in the future.
I reached out and nervously took the card. In neat curling letters, it spelled one word: death. And underneath was a normal-looking 7-digit phone number. "Your death," I said, still unsure of the reality of the situation. "And you have your own business card?"
Yes, it's a matter of business. Managing products, shipments of goods, making sure the guys up top are kept happy. You know, it's all business.
Death explained with a shrug.
Anyway, this card is for you, and if you find yourself in need of assistance, feel free to give me a ring, anytime. I can't guarantee I'll be there every time, but I will certainly try and be there when I am needed.
Death offered his hand again, asking for a handshake. Not knowing what else to do, I stuffed the business card in the front pocket of my hoodie before reaching out and accepting his hand. If he really was Death, that would certainly explain his ice-cold skin. Death left shortly after handing me the business card. He turned and walked down the alley, but vanished after only a few steps. I remember that I managed to make it to a back road I knew and to a bus stop before I passed out. When I came to, I was in a hospital bed with Jeffrey standing over me, grinning like a madman. His normally neatly combed back hair was slightly messy, and there was a beginning of a black eye on his face.
Jeez, man, I didn't know you had it in you.
I gave him a confused look. "What do you mean?" He leaned down and whispered to me.
"Man, Daniel, you didn't just take out the Jamie bastard. You got Carl and Mark too. You single-handedly took out our biggest competitors. Good job."
"Oh," I said weakly. Those names meant very little to me. I wasn't involved too much in politics. I just followed Jeffrey around and helped him when I could. He was basically my brother.
"Man, Dalton and them have to let you be official now,"
he said, ruffling my hair. I smiled weakly. I didn't care about being officially accepted into the inner circle, so to speak. But it seemed to make Jeff happy, so I figured I could play along. As soon as Jeffrey left and I was alone in my room, I reached over to the side table where my bloody clothing was folded in a plastic bag and fished out my hoodie. Had I really met death? Did I just black out and make up everything? The card was the only thing I could hold on to as proof, if in fact, I still had the card. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified when I pulled the black business card from the pocket. Jeff was right about one thing: the incident at the warehouse that sent me on the way to becoming official. The day after I left the hospital, well, more like escaped, as no one had any intentions of paying the bill, I decided that I was going to learn how to properly use a gun. Despite the fact that my first experience with one had been less than successful, I found that I actually had a talent for firearms. I used this talent to rise in the ranks until I was the unquestioned person to go for, as Jeffrey so delicately put it, to clean up. By the time I was 19, I had lost count of how many people I had killed. It probably should have bothered me more than it did, but Jeff was so encouraging, and it wasn't as though I had much of a talent for anything else, so I went with it. While I was rising, it seemed that Jeff was sinking. But it didn't dawn on me exactly how far Jeff had fallen until I received a simple text message one night. It was written in a code only a few people understood, but the message was clear. Apparently, Jeff had been caught stealing money, and the higher-ups decided that it was time to clean up the matter. I hadn't seen Jeff in weeks. I had moved out when I was 18 and was living rather well on my own, and people tended to pay good money to have their messes cleaned up. I stared at the message for about 30 minutes, unsure of what to do with myself. I'd been killing people for 3 years, but I had never felt this ache in the pit of my stomach before. This sort of hesitation and doubt. Everything I had done before was for Jeff's approval. He was as large a part of the reason I was doing so well. Hell, he had practically raised me. How could I possibly turn around and do this? Still holding the cell phone, I sank down into my couch. How could I suddenly be unsure about killing when the very couch I was paid on was paid for with blood money? Without really thinking, I pulled my wallet from my back pocket. I had held on to the business card this whole time. It was currently tucked in the back of my wallet. I hadn't looked at it properly since I was in the hospital 3 years ago, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Despite the time that had passed, the card was still in perfect condition. Pure black cardstock with neat white letters spelled out death, and under that, "Any questions, please call." I looked at it confused. Had it changed? I hadn't looked at it a while, but I was sure the part about questions wasn't there before. I figured it was just a trick my mind was pulling and I forgot about it. I dialed the number, not knowing what I was to expect. No sooner had I entered the number and pressed the phone to my ear did I hear death. Only his voice wasn't coming from the phone, but from right behind me.
"You rang,"
he said, sounding amused. I dropped the phone and turned to see Death standing behind the couch, not looking any different than he had the night at the warehouse. Yeah, I trailed off. Why had I called him? It seemed like a good idea. I was conflicted about something that could possibly result in death, so who was better to consult than Death himself?
"You want to know if you should follow the order, like the many you have followed before, and kill your friend,"
Death said, stealing words straight from my brain. He moved from behind the couch and made himself comfortable in a chair across from me. He sat down delicately, crossing his legs, propping his arm on the side of the chair and resting his head on his hand lazily. Yeah, it seemed I was only capable of one-syllable answers this evening.
This is a dilemma, isn't it? Kill the man who basically raised you to be what you are today, or risk losing your credibility in your chosen profession. Tough choice.
He paused, looking down at his fingernails as though inspecting them for dirt. Jeff, he took care of me when no one else did. Even when he was only 17 and selling dope to my mom, he would always ask how my schoolwork was coming and bringing me treats. I was 12 years old and excited at the aspect of counting a real live gangster as one of my friends. He always called me the brother he never had. I looked over at Death, who looked unimpressed by my emotional recall of my childhood.
Daniel,
He said, and I jumped at the sound of him using my name.
let me share a secret of the world. People are fleeting. In the end, you are the only person left who will look out for you. Remember that.
But how can I just go and shoot him, just like that, and ignore everything he's done for me? I was becoming frustrated. Not because Death wasn't saying what I wanted him to, but because he was saying exactly what I needed to hear.
Think of it this way.
He said, leaning forward in his chair.
Joffrey wanted you to succeed in life, correct?
I nodded.
Then he would not want you to turn down a job this important.
He finished, grinning. I don't know if I can do this, I muttered as I looked down at the discarded cell phone.
Sure you can. I'll even go with you.
Death said, standing up from his chair.
If you think it would help you, remember that. In the end, you are not killing anyone. I am.
I nodded, and just like that, I made up my mind to kill the man who raised me. Death was true to his word. He followed me along the all-too-familiar path to Jeff's apartment building. It was freezing outside. I was bundled in a thick leather jacket and skin-tight leather gloves encased my hands. Under my jacket, I could feel the weight of the gun against my hip. It was like an icicle hanging from my belt. Despite the cold air, Death did not seem the least bit fazed, even though he was still dressed in the same simple suit I'd first seen him in. In no time at all, I was standing outside the door to Jeff's apartment, fighting back memories with Death standing idly behind me whistling. He had assured me that no one could hear him or see him except me, which was comforting and awkward at the same time. I knocked, and Jeff came to the door. He looked terrible. His blonde hair that was normally kept short and slicked back was a greasy mess hanging down over his face. His eyes had thick, dark circles under them, and there were a few fresh cuts to it.
Hey, Daniel, man. What brings you here?
His voice was weak and cracked, but he still seemed glad to see me. Can I come in? I said, smiling slightly. I glanced back at Death, who offered what I could only assume was an encouraging smile.
Yeah, sure. It's filthy in here, but when hasn't it been?
He laughed weakly and stepped aside, allowing me in. As soon as I was in, he closed and locked the door. I noticed the addition of several more locks. He knew people would be after him. Death materialized in the apartment and stood behind me.
Do it quickly. Get it over with,
He said. It was like the cartoons of devils and angels on people's shoulders who guide their actions. Except I was missing my angel. I needed to talk to you, I said.
No, you didn't.
Death whispered.
Sure.
Jeff said, motioning to the cluttered living room. There were piles of dishes and clothing everywhere, along with several half-packed suitcases and boxes. He moved over to a set of chairs and began shifting through the mess to clear off a place to sit. As his back was turned, I reached into my coat and wrapped my hands around the gun. There was a heavy silencer attached, making the gun heavier, but it was comfortable in my hand. Jeff's back was to me when I moved closer and took aim. Death was now standing next to me, just in my line of vision. My finger was positioned on the trigger, ready to pull it when Jeff turned around. His eyes went wide. There was a look of complete and utter despair on his face. I felt myself waver until Death reached out and placed an icy cold hand on my wrist.
Daniel.
Jeff breathed. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I wasn't sure if he even heard me, because at the same time, I squeezed the trigger. Despite what people think, silencers don't make guns silent. They quiet them down, but guns are still loud weapons. I didn't have the time to stand around and contemplate what I had just done. Death was smiling as he followed me back to my apartment. I knew this was his job and everything, but I couldn't figure out what about this situation made him so happy. Regardless of how I felt after killing Jeff, it had an undeniable positive effect on my career. It made me look heartless and cold and ruthless, which apparently were traits that were highly valuable in my profession. I found out very quickly that word of mouth was the best business plan anyone could use, and though I kept myself available for my original employers, freelance work was easy to find and very lucrative. 2 years after Jeffrey had died, I had enough resources to make myself disappear. I kept taking jobs because it was the only thing I knew. I had been completely desensitized to death. On the matter of death, I still kept the card tucked in the back of my wallet no matter where I went. Interestingly, the card never showed any signs of wear and tear. 4 days before my 24th birthday, I took possibly the biggest job of my career. I avoid politics like the plague, but I could tell this job was important and therefore political, and simply based on the number of zeros attached to the payment. It was a sniper job, which I didn't particularly care for, but the amount I was being paid far outweighed any personal preference I had. The worst part about sniper jobs was the waiting. I was glad, at least, for the comfortable weather. Not too warm, but with just enough of a chill to the air to make it pleasant. Being that I was jammed in an awkward corner on an apartment building roof, I took comfort where I could find it. My gun was set up, aiming at the hotel down the street. The target was supposed to be there by 8 o'clock. It was already past 7:50. I had only the briefest chance for a shot. I saw the target's entourage turn the corner and I took my position behind the scope. I had no idea which car the target was in, but I aimed somewhere in the middle, hoping I had the time I needed to make the shot. The car doors opened and I took aim. I was ready. I had to wonder, though, who was this man that was worth so much money? I had heard his name around, but I wasn't exactly sure who he was. I blinked and focused back to the scope before squeezing the trigger. As soon as I did, I realized something had gone very wrong. I had been off focus. I missed the target completely. I must have hit someone because there was chaos in the street. I cursed aloud to myself. This was too large of a job to screw up. I refocused, trying to see if I could still get a shot in, and quickly realized there was no way to do it. I needed to move fast. I didn't have time to fix my mistake.
You know, daydreaming on a job is a rather bad habit.
I twisted around in my hiding place to see Death standing over me. I was tempted to yell at him to get down before I remembered that I was the only one that could see him. "I didn't call you. Why are you here?" I hissed, beginning to disassemble my gun.
You don't need a phone to call me,
he said, squatting down to be on my eye level.
Anyway, I can help you.
Why would you do that?
No reason,
he said with a smile that said just the opposite.
Stop that.
He motioned to me as I was attaching the scope.
Just take aim, and I will take care of the rest.
I was about to tell him there was nothing he could possibly do when he suddenly vanished. I screwed the scope back into place quickly and looked down at the scene. I couldn't make heads or tails of what was going on. I saw a group of dark-suited men in a huddle and assumed that was where the target was. Death had about 10 seconds to prove he could do something before I was gone. 4 seconds into my countdown, I watched Death calmly stroll over to the group of men. He lingered outside the huddle for a few seconds before the suits dispersed and I saw the target clearly. He was pushing his guards away from him and moving more into the open. I didn't want to miss my second chance, and pulled the trigger once more. In time with the gunshot, Death reappeared beside me.
You're welcome, kid.
How did you do that? Why did you do that?
I'm deaf. I can do a lot. And because I felt like it. Anyway, a heads up. Next time I see you, I will be asking a favor.
Death said. and for the first time since I met him, his face was void of any smile. It was 3 days after the nearly botched job on the roof that I found out who the man I shot was. Apparently, he was some newly elected president of a war-torn country, and was winning all sorts of human rights awards for ending the war and helping the people of his country. But his death had started yet another war. I had single-handedly started a war. Not only had I started it, I had killed a man who had done nothing but try and bring peace. The second time in my life I was convinced I was going to die, I was 26 years old. I had found myself back in my hometown, which was probably my first mistake. There were a number of bridges I had burned when I disappeared, but still, for some reason, I found myself walking the same streets I had once followed Jeff down. I got a room in an out-of-the-way motel. I had no idea what I was doing with my life. After the rooftop incident, and inadvertently starting a war, I pulled myself off the radar and took a vacation of sorts. 2 years later, I was back at home. Nothing seemed to have changed. The small diner Jeff and I would go to after his weekly drops was still there and still serving the same chili cheese fries he and I would split. I ordered a plate of them for dinner, but couldn't manage to eat the whole thing. I wandered around the city block for a few hours, taking in the subtle changes. The warehouses where I had almost died and first met death were no longer abandoned, and the apartment building Jeff had lived in was condemned. I should have cared more than I did. I just couldn't bring myself to really care about anything. I stared up at the apartment building and realized that I didn't regret killing Jeff. Somehow, I didn't regret anything. Having enough of nostalgia, I headed back to my hotel, cutting through alleyways and taking back streets. Even after all this time, I knew this city like the back of my hand. As I walked back, I found myself thinking about death. I was still puzzled about what he said about asking a favor of me, but 2 years later, I had yet to hear from him. I occasionally pulled the card from my wallet and looked at it, considered calling, but never actually following through. I was curious on how he knew I needed help that day on the roof. I had stopped thinking about the oddity of having Death's phone number a while ago. I just considered it my special gift, my talent, and the one thing that really set me apart from the rest of the world. I didn't question if he was real or not anymore. Occasionally, logic reared its ugly head, but the matter was too tiring to attempt to sort out. Death was a young, average man with dirty blonde hair and simple features who always wore a dark suit and a smile. That was it. I was caught up in my thoughts, and since my feet knew the way, I wasn't exactly paying attention to my surroundings. I did notice, however, when I felt the cool metal of a gun barrel pressed against my back. I had 3 different weapons on my person at the moment, and I could tell from where the gun was pressed that the would-be shooter was more likely just a kid. I held up my hands dramatically before turning around. "Kid, this is a bad idea."
Shut up.
The kid snarled, and I couldn't help but be reminded of myself. He couldn't be more than 15 years old, and it was obvious that he was in way over his head and completely oblivious. It was easy to look at his short black hair and instead see my own brown hair matted and sweaty on my nervous brow. I see his short, pudgy stature, and instead see my own awkward, lanky stance. It was so surreal, like looking through a one-way mirror into the past. "Well, is this a robbery? Is that what the guys are asking for nowadays to get in?" I asked, adding air quotes with my fingers.
No,
The kid said sharply.
I know who you are. They told me if I killed you, they would forgive my brother.
I wasn't surprised. I figured Dalton would have some hurt feelings since I left for bigger and better things. "Oh, really? So what exactly did your brother do?"
None of your damn business, but I have to kill you.
His hands were shaking as he pointed the gun at me. I took a step back, Sorry, kid, but I have no intention of dying tonight, so I think we have a problem. I lowered my hands and the kid tensed. He wasn't going to shoot me. There was no way. I started to reach into my jacket slowly as the kid stood shaken, his gun still trained on my stomach.
Stop moving,
the kid yelled. I just shook my head. Look, kid, we both know you aren't gonna. I was interrupted mid-sentence by a sharp pain in my gut. I hadn't even registered the gunshot before I was doubled over, holding my stomach in shock as blood rushed from my body. I looked up at the kid. His eyes went wide, and terror etched on his face. He tossed the gun away before turning and running away, leaving me alone in a back alley bleeding. My brain was a jumble of pain, but somehow, I managed to convince my body to listen to me. I dug my wallet from my pocket and fumbled for Death's business card. The card was barely in my hand before I heard Death's distinctive voice from down the alley.
This is a familiar sight,
he said, his tone painfully cheerful. Please. Help.
The last time something like this happened, you seemed so ready to expire. Why have things changed?
He asked. He was now standing over me, smirking. I don't want to die, I said. And I didn't. I never wanted to die. I was scared to die. Death was a natural thing for a human to be fearful of.
Not quite.
Death piped in, reminding me of his ability to read my mind.
Most humans, when face to face with death, are not fearful. 10 years ago, you were accepting, but now, after 10 years of bloodshed and body counts, you are fearful.
What? I wheezed, my body denying my attempt at speaking. Death knelt in front of me.
Daniel, you were a good kid 10 years ago. You were a stupid kid following around your hero in a desperate attempt for approval. You were normal.
Death paused for a moment, looking up at the night sky with a considerate look on his face.
You want to know a secret? You were supposed to die behind that warehouse 10 years ago.
I had figured as much. At this point, I was grateful Death had access to my thoughts because my body had all but given up. One hand was still pressed into the wound on my stomach, though it was doing nothing to stop the blood.
I set you on your path. I helped you along when you needed it and molded you into exactly what I wanted you to be.
What was that? I thought, and Death's face lit up.
To be me.
He stood up and shrugged off his suit jacket, and I saw at once that the shirt I'd always assumed was a dark red was actually white. And the red was a stain that blossomed out from Death's chest.
You see,
he said, undoing the top button of his shirt.
Death, this form of death anyway, starts as a human that must meet certain requirements, one of those being a body count. That part is easy enough to get, but it's the details that are difficult.
He pulled open the top of his shirt, and I saw a gaping wound in the center of his chest.
Betrayal,
Death said, counting on his fingers.
And killing of peace, and then the absence of guilt.
He paused.
Well, and of course, the body count, which by the way, yours is great. It far outnumbers mine, and I was killed in war.
You died? I questioned in my head, and Death smiled.
Over 400 years ago. Just like you, I was groomed to fulfill every aspect of becoming Death.
I stared at Death, my vision becoming fuzzy. I felt my body shiver and shake. I was dying. This was it. My mind began to panic, but all the same sensation was like that of falling asleep. And the closer to sleep I got, the less aware of the pain I was. Just as I was drifting off into darkness, I felt a violent jerk that pulled me back to reality and pain.
The downside of being deaf,
he said, poking at his own wound.
This has been bleeding for centuries, and I still can't get used to it.
He looked to me.
Death isn't dead, by the way. You will live in that state you are now, forever, or until you can find someone to replace you.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was a dream. It had to be. I'd wake up and I would be in my hotel, or better yet, I'd wake up and be 16, sleeping on just a fold-away sofa.
Wishful thinking will get you nowhere. That is just friendly advice.
Death said. I looked up at him. Somehow my vision was restoring itself, but the pain in my gut was growing stronger. Death suddenly let out a terrifying laugh and fell to his knees. I watched as his body began to decay like a video on fast forward. In the span of a few seconds, I watched as his skin bloated and then shrank. His hair grew, becoming discolored and fell from his scalp. His bones became visible as skin slid off in chunks before turning to ash and disappearing. When the man I once knew as Death was nothing more than a skeleton, he turned to me.
I finally can rest. I finally can die. And for once, I am not afraid.
I watched as his bones fell into a pile of dust, and at the same moment, I felt all sense of dying disappear. I was no longer tired, and my body no longer felt as though it was shutting down. The bullet wound in my stomach still hurt like hell, but I wasn't dying. I slowly pulled myself to my feet and realized I still had the business card in my hand. It was now smeared with my blood, and instead of the neat letters spelling out death and a phone number, there were 4 words.
Your turn. Have fun.
This concludes our story. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the content. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.